Our seminar today is dedicated to a very interesting topic, the European External Action Service and its coordination with the member states, which is of course a very interesting and somewhat sensitive topic as well, that has been discussed in the EU for a number of years, now overshadowed for some time by the economic crisis, but now coming again to the forefront of the discussions in the EU. And I'm happy that we organize this seminar in a trilateral format together with CERI, Sciences Po. The main speaker will be Christian Lequesne, who will be in more detail introduced in a moment. But it is also important to stress that our second partner is the Prague Centre français, CEFRES, whose director, Philippe Rusin, is here as well. The interesting thing is that we in fact have two directors here because, as you might know, Christian Lequesne is a former director of the same institution. So there are quite a few directors sitting behind the table. But I also would like to welcome our Czech guest, Vojtěch Belling, who is the State Secretary for European Affairs, who will serve as a discussant. I will not add much to what I have already said. I'll just say that it is a rare occasion when we really have to think about where our seminars take place, because it happened to us after a long time that we had to stop the registration for this event. Clearly it's given, it depends also on the topic, but also on the speakers, that we really have so many people here who are interested in hearing what you have to say about it. So with that, I'd like to pass the floor to Philippe, who will chair the meeting today. Philippe, please.
Thank you very much, Pat. It's a great pleasure for me to have you today. I would like to thank very much UMV for hosting us today, and particularly the director, Petr Kratochvíl. I would like just to say a few words to introduce Christian Lequesne. So Christian is a political scientist at CERI Sciences Po. He's actually former director of CERI Sciences Po, because he was director till the very end of 2013. So we are all expecting from him more time for research now that he will be that he is discharged from very heavy administrative charges at CERI, and it's a very great pleasure for me to have him today. The topic of his paper is the European External Action Service and Member States Diplomacies, the limits of vertical coordination. It's based on more than 30 interviews made by Christian, mainly in Brussels at the Commission, at Member State representation in Brussels, but also with diplomats in Paris, in Prague, Czech Republic, in Lebanon, in Beirut. So we'll hear what are the first results of this research on the ground of Christian. It's a paper which is under publication, I would say, but Christian will say a few words about it for sure. And in our name, I would like also to thank very warmly Mr. Vojtěch Belling, State Secretary for European Affairs. That is, for the French part, the equivalent of the Secrétariat Général des Affaires Européennes in France. So Mr. Belling has a coordination role at the office of the Czech government. And the idea of this, so I would like to thank you, Mr. Belling, really very warmly, because of course of the dynamic political process being in movement, I would say, in Prague right now. And the idea of the seminar was to mix a political scientist, so the profile of an academic, research fellow and a practitioner, I would say, even if of course Mr. Belling has post-career at Charles University. So the idea is to mix regards, cross regards about European affairs and a European coordination mechanism. So Christian, I will give you the floor for, let's say, about 35-40 minutes. And then I will give the floor to Mr. Belling for a few comments, and then give the floor to the audience, to you, in order to have a discussion. So Christian, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Philippe. Thank you to both directors and both institutions for the invitation. It's always a great pleasure for me to go back to Prague, because as some of you know, I spent part of my professional life here, 3 years in fact, which were, well, a great experience in my career. And thank you also to State Secretary Belling for accepting to comment what well, an academic is going to say about your practice. So it would be interesting to have the input of somebody like you who well, is leaving all these procedures on a daily basis. Well, I am more generally now focusing my research on the evolution of diplomatic practices in Europe, and this is why I have a look on the experience of the European External Action Service. The presentation I'm doing this morning is part of a broader project, an edited book, which will be directed by 3 colleagues, and I know that we have also a contribution from one of our colleagues from the Institute to this book on the external service and national diplomacy. So what I was asked is to focus a bit more on the question of vertical coordination between the EEAS and the member states. Let me start with some preliminary remark about the literature on EU foreign policy, where there is a huge body of literature, textbooks, articles, etc. And when you have a look on it, well, most of the scholarly pieces are emphasizing the crucial need for coordination or coherent or consistency, well, in a multi-actors policy. And when this literature is normative, and sometimes it happens, well, it concludes that the money transaction costs, between the actors of the EU foreign policies are the roots of a lack of effectiveness. So we have to think about being more coherent to be more effective. One thing which strikes me is that well, large part of this literature on the EU foreign policy probably mythologizes the centrality of government in the shaping of foreign policy, and we forget sometimes the experience of the states. When you compare what is going on at the EU level with what's going on at the state level, well, you observe that at the state level, fragmentation between the different ministries, the head of state and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, etc., or also between the foreign ministries and subnational governments, especially in federal states, well, exists. So do not mythologize too much the centrality of foreign policy in the states versus, well, fragmentation in the EU. And well, you know also from your national experience that when you have coalition government, for instance, it's not easy sometimes to get decision, because you have many transactions between the different ministers representing different political parties. The federal states is an interesting experience I had a look on what was produced by Canadian colleagues in particular, but also by Belgian colleague. I think the comparison on the EU foreign policy making with the foreign policy making in the federal state is maybe a track that we have to investigate a bit more, because in both cases we have polities with multi-level governance and the same kind of problem in the making and the implementation of foreign policy. And sometimes I regret that the scholars coming mostly from IR theory do not look on the experience of federal states, because we probably have here a good occasion to have comparison on the question of the EU foreign policy. This is why the Canadians are in particular relevant, because they are usually doing this kind of comparison. So coordination is a central purpose in most of the literature on EU foreign policy, and more generally coordination is a central purpose in the literature on organizations. Well, again, if you try to find definition of what is coordination, you will find a huge body of theory, management theory, organizational theory, etc. One of the problems of this literature is that usually they do not differentiate, well, coordination in public organization from coordination in private organizations. Okay, they just deal with organization in general, and in the case of the External Action Service, of course, coordination consists in well, assuming in a public organization well, a bureaucratic function in order to conciliate the efficient and legitimate also foreign policy with a strong degree of diversity. And you have two kinds of diversity. You have an horizontal diversity. This is the problem of the relation between the EEAS and the other supranational institution, and especially the Commission. And you have the vertical diversity. This is the relations, the problem of coordination between the EEAS and the 28 member states. And what I'm going to do is to focus only on the vertical dimension. It does not mean that nothing has to be said about the vertical coordination. I think a lot has to be said between the relations between the EEAS and the Commission. Maybe sometimes more difficult to coordinate at the horizontal level than it is at the vertical level. And how am I trying to capture the problem of vertical coordination? Well, I'm doing that through three issues: question of staff, question of what I call share of resources, and question of procedures. And as Philippe mentioned in his introduction, most of what I'm saying is the result of empirical work, interviews done between 2011 and 2013. Let me start with the question of the personnel, question of the staff. Well, as you probably know, the EEAS is an amalgamation of three groups of officials: commissioned civil servants, working primarily, most of them in the former RELEX Directorate General at the Commission, but also people coming from the former Commission delegations and from the Directorate General for Development, what we call in the Brussels jargon DEFCO. Second, you had the civil servants from the General Secretariat of the Council, well, people who used to work with Javier Solana on common foreign and security policy and defense policy, and you have finally the national diplomats coming from the national ministries of foreign affairs. If you take the figures at the end of 2011, so 2 years ago, national diplomats represented 19% of all the personnel, 29% of the position in the delegation, and we have 140 delegation, but only 13% of the personnel of the staff in the central structures in the headquarters in Brussels. The national diplomat could stay 10 years, 2 contracts of 4 years plus 2 extra years, but this is the limit, and after 10 years they are supposed to return to their national administrations. What is interesting is that since 2011, of course, national governments, national ministries of foreign affairs have insisted that national diplomats should be more represented, especially also as head of delegations, because in the original deal it says that they should represent one third of the total staff. And when you take the current situation, we had a midterm review in July 2013. Well, it shows that in general this target of 1/3 for national diplomat is reached. But it's probably more the case in the delegation than it is the case in the headquarters. For those who are interested in sociology of decision, it was interesting to see how the different ministries of foreign affairs try to lobby, try to develop a discourse on the importance to have national diplomats. I know that in the Czech case it was the case also because in the Czech case the problem so far as I understood is not so much the delegation, but it's more the headquarters in Brussels. So it's not easy also for national ministries to accept that people go to Brussels, because sometimes you just lose your best people, you know. So this is a question that we are going to discuss afterwards. What about these amalgamations? Difficult to say in English. So, in theory, this pooling of people coming from different backgrounds should facilitate the vertical coordination between the EEAS and the national diplomacies. And scholars and practitioners, they regularly raise the question of, we're going to have a new esprit de corps. I'm using this French word, which is also used in English, because you will get a fusion of the different identities, in this new administration. Well, but nobody is really able to say with certainty if this fusion already exists or not. And what I got from my work is that differences of identity still remain. They still remain, and they remain between two groups of officials, the former or the EU civil servants on one side, and the national diplomats on the other side. And the problem is not that the differences is reflecting objective capacities or inabilities of each group to do a certain number of tasks. It's more the question of subjectivity. And this is the important thing for us. It's a question of perception of what each group is able to do or not to do. Okay, so I would advise young scholars, for instance, who are doing PhD, to look at it with a constructivist approach, which is probably more interesting, because a lot of things have to do with perception, with representations. This idea that we believe that the other groups do not necessarily share the same norms and values. And when you're doing interviews, you can capture that. It's interesting. For instance, when you talk with commissions officials, sometimes they suspect that the presence of national diplomats into the external service is just a way to renationalize the EU foreign policy. I'm quoting in the paper one Commission official who said, well, I quote, "The foreign policy made by the External Service is not the one I expected when I decided to enter the Commission in the 80s. For me, an efficient foreign policy should express the community interest, and national diplomats are not able to do so." Which is not probably true. But what is interesting, again, it's not the objective argument, is the perception and the representation. And on the other side, probably national diplomats very much believe that a certain number of tasks, which are just routine for them, like writing political reports, because this is what the diplomat knows. You know, he knows how to write political, is something that the people from the commissions are not able to do. Again, it's probably not so easy, because some of the civil servants coming from former DG Relex are perfectly able to write political reports. But in the mind, in the perception, it is there, and this is interesting. The problem, the conflicts of working cultures are compounded by the fact that if you take the delegations abroad, well, you have only 1/3 of the staff which is belonging to the EEAS. 2/3 are employed and still employed by the EU Commission. And well, if you take also the situation well outside the building of the EU delegation, I think member states ambassadors are now less reluctant than they could have been in the past to accept that the EU heads of delegation coordinate meetings on a regular basis. But still, when you're doing interview, you feel sometimes a critique vis-à-vis their diplomatic skills, you know, of the people coming from the Commission. Those people are not totally like us. That's a bit. I'm quoting a French ambassador, and it's interesting, who said, well, you know, people, I quote, "People from the Commission serving in EU delegation, their first reflex when a country enters a war or a deep crisis is to go back to Brussels for security matters. We, national diplomats, our first reflex is to stay by any means, because it is during crisis that our job reaches a maximum utility." Okay. Of course, and then I asked the question, but give me a concrete example of that, Mr. Ambassador. Well, he was not able to give me any concrete example, of course. But again, what is important is the perception of difference in the minds, you know, and probably it introduces a lack of trust vis-à-vis the other group, which play still a role in the difficulty sometimes to have a vertical coordination. Let me move now to my second issue, which is resource sharing. Well, again, if you take the literature on diplomacy, and you have a lot of books on contemporary diplomacy, the share of information is well described as a crucial point for doing modern diplomacy. And when you interview people, could be EEAS official, but could be also national diplomats, well, they all emphasize the fact that providing a better share of resources between national diplomacy and EU institution, well, is something which will facilitate vertical coordination. So what does it mean? Well, first thing is the question of co-locating embassies, the co-location of embassies. We have example of that. For instance, the Spaniards, they decided to post a Spanish diplomat in the EU delegation in Sana'a in Yemen. So, and if you read the review, the 2013 review, you will see that this successful placement of a Spanish diplomat has created saving of up to 500,000 euro for the Spanish national budget. And well, as you know, the Spanish national budget has some problems. Well, a lot of budgets in Europe have a problem, but the Spanish budget in particular, even as the situation is improving. But when you have a look on the number of experience, what strikes me is that it remains limited. It remains limited. And my impression is that the different member states do not express the same approach in this question of co-location. I don't particularly like the difference between small and big member states because, again, this is not objective. This is also a question of subjectivity, but we use it all the time. So this is why I'm going to take the difference a bit for granted. But my impression is that the ministries of foreign affairs of the small member states, like Estonia, Luxembourg, maybe Slovakia, which have a limited network of bilateral embassies, well, for them it's an interesting perspective to co-locate the embassies, the consulate, or in a more minimal version, to make use of the work done by the EU delegation. When I interview people from the big member states, like the UK, France, my impression is, which have an extended network of a bilateral embassy, they are less interested to the question of being represented by the EU delegations abroad. And this reaction has to do also with the symbolic of being a big state, okay, which is part of the historical narrative on the nation, etc. Something struck me a lot. I had the privilege to be invited as an observatory participant to the meeting of the ambassadors in France in September. And there were a panel on the question of rationalizing the network of embassies and consulate, which is, well, something all the ministries of foreign affairs are talking about, okay, because it costs a lot of money to have post abroad in a period where public expenses are constrained. France has the highest number of diplomatic and consular posts abroad after the USA. And there was a panel organized by the Director General in charge of administrative reform to discuss with the different ambassadors. You know, you have the same in Czech Republic. All the ambassadors are coming, and this is an opportunity for them to say, well, what they feel, what is wrong. Well, when they say that, because they are prudent sometimes to say things, and be very interesting in the French case to an anthropologist could have done a fantastic work, because you had the ambassador of the big member states at the first row, and then you had a sort of hierarchy, you know, in the room. It was absolutely fascinating. And what struck me is that we talk about rationalization of the network of posts, but no single word was pronounced during the 2 hours debate on collocating diplomatic and consular agents within the EU delegation. Nothing. Okay? So this is an indicator of how in a big member state, you know, the debate about collocation is not really there, because, national presence in the world cannot be confounded with EU presence, you know, both concretely but also symbolically. That's the point. That's the point. It costs money, but, well, being there, you know, it's part of our history, it's part, etc. So then you have the explanation why you have in Dakar, I think 20 embassies represented. We need really 20 embassies in Dakar, but we have to look also on the question of symbol and question of symbolic. And my impression is that this symbolic question is probably more pronounced in the so-called big member state than in the small member state. What about reinforcing the technical networks to exchange diplomatic information? Well, we have some networks already. We have the CORE system for CFSP. We have the system for consular affairs, you know, exchange of cables between the different ministries. Well, but there is no system of encrypted network between the EEAS, the Commission, on the 28 member states working, well, on a general basis. Well, it's coming, but when you take the review and when you take the decision of December 2013, having a system of encrypted network is not at the agenda. It's not at the agenda, okay? But everybody is talking about that. That's interesting. Everybody said, well, it would be better if we could exchange more. But my impression also that it would be difficult to have it, because when you consider economic and trade diplomacy, then the member states are still competitors. Could you imagine in China, the German and the French embassies exchanges their analysis on the political situation when the companies are in competition for contracts? I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure. Okay. And maybe there is also a symbolic reason. Whatever the rules the EU has introduced for the exchange of information, my impression is that cable and reports, well, remain also in the perception of diplomat the expression of the national interest, which requires a state confinement. And again, it's not the problem to know if national interest exists or not, because we can discuss hours and hours about the existence of national interest. Again, it's a problem of perception by national diplomats that it still exists. So it's a question of cognitive frame, and this is something which struck me in my interview. Let me finish with the third point, and I hope I have still time. Yes, the procedural issue. Well, right from the start, member states accepted new procedures to ensure vertical coordination. One new procedural rule is the permanent chairmanship of committees, especially the political and security committees, plus also a certain number of geographical and thematic working groups. There are 16 in the area of CFSP and external affairs. So it means that those groups are not shared anymore by the rotating presidencies, but by permanent people belonging to the EEAS. And it has, if we are taking a rational legal point of view, it has a certain coherence if the High Representative has become the permanent chair of all the sessions of the Council of Foreign Affairs, including development and defense issues. So you have now working groups chaired by EEAS people integrated into the chart of the EEAS. So it places the officials of the EEAS at the heart of vertical coordination, and probably it enabled them to provide more continuity than the rotating presidency in the past, because by definition rotating presidency is changing every 6 months, and it's rare that the problem is solved in 6 months. So it provides more continuity for the management of negotiation. And what strikes me is that member state officials have accepted the legitimacy of EEAS chairperson without much resistance, probably because they perceive a managerial improvement in the change. On the other hand, it's true that this permanent chairmanship has reduced the dynamism of each state for initiatives. When the job was the monopoly of the rotating presidency, then you had some national priorities. Well, Swedish diplomats proactive to promote human rights, Polish diplomats to develop Eastern Partnership, Czech diplomats to promote Eastern Partnership. This is less the case since 2010. But again, I have the impression that the reinforcement of the managerial function is considered more a priority by the national diplomats than keeping a margin of maneuver for initiative. But maybe we should not also exaggerate the importance of rotating presidencies in, well, setting up initiatives. Maybe we slightly we exaggerate a bit the tendency, or we attribute too much power to rotating presidency in an agenda setting in general. In EU delegations, well, we have regular coordination meetings between the member states, and there is, I think, a better acceptance of this vertical coordination by a member states ambassador. So, you know, the time is over where a French ambassador in an African country refused to speak with the Commission representative because he said, well, this guy is not a member of the diplomatic corps. You know, this time is over. This time is totally finished. But it does not mean that the heads of delegation, of EU delegation, have become the most influential diplomats in third countries. And here I'm coming with my Lebanese example. Well, you know, third countries diplomats, they have also in mind power scales on which, well, national diplomats continue to be positioned. If you take Beirut, for instance, it's clear that in the perception of the Lebanese diplomats, and it was quite clear in my interviews, the British and the French ambassador remain the most influential EU representatives. It means that the Lebanese government will not conclude a deal with the EU against the position of the British and the French embassies. But it will force the French and the Brits also to speak with the others, to have a negotiation, and at the end to have a form of coordination made by the EU head of delegation in Beirut. So institutions are not substitute to power, even if, well, institutions do matter in regulating power. And this is exactly what the neo-institutionalists are saying, for those who are interested in theory. There are sometimes limits in policy terms. If I take my Lebanese example, but it would be true in other countries as well, the British ambassadors, for instance, always refused that the EU head of delegation organize meetings on consular affairs, because considered that consular affairs is out of the scope of the EU. It's a national competence. It's a national competence. Okay. So when the EU head of delegation tried to organize meeting on the evacuation of EU civilians in times of crisis, it was firmly contested by the British ambassador. And all the meetings related to that remain chaired by the rotating presidency and not by the head of delegation. But this is a topic we have to look at, because it's not over, especially when you read the conclusion of the December 2013 Council, which says the possibilities for developing the role of EU delegation in facilitating and supporting coordination between member states in their role in providing consular protection to citizens of the Union and third countries, etc., etc., is a goal of the EU. So we will have nice exchange and controversies probably between the British government and the other partners of that, especially because for a majority of the member states, well, consular protection should be a step to make the EU citizenship concrete for nationals, and we have to consider the nationals are more and more mobile and of course exposed to insecurity abroad, but it will also mean the improvement of technical skills, because doing consular work is something very specific, and nobody really among the EEAS for the moment is well able to do that. Well, so in general, I would say if you take the vertical coordination on a day-to-day basis in the working groups and in the delegation, it's working much better than it did, but with limits. And my example on consular affairs is one of these limits. What about multilateral international organizations? Because I talk a lot about third countries. Well, first of all, what a mess. If you try to understand what about the representation of the EU in the international organizations. Well, there's so many differences of status from one IO to another, and it's a topic of battles between the member states and the EU, and it is very good for legal scholars, you know, because they have a lot of work to do, legal scholars, on that. So it's godsend for legal scholars. Well, I'm not going now to give you the list of the different statuses, but you probably know in WTO the EU has the same membership than the individual member state. In the UN system, well, the EU is not represented in the same way within the different specialized institutions. But since 2011, the EU has an observer status at the UN General Assembly, while the 28 states are full members. At the UN Security Council, as you know, the EU has no representation as such. Could be a topic in the future, also coming from the pressures from the emerging countries. There is in the Treaty of Lisbon an article which says that the High Representative is invited to address EU positions, but well, it's not really what happens. So in New York, if I take the UN, the EU delegation has replaced what existed before Commission delegation and what we call the liaison office of the EU Council. And this delegation organized more than 1,000 meetings every year. It's relatively easy to well, have a certain coordination and coherence for the General Assembly affairs. Because when we are dealing with human rights, when we're dealing with the question of rule of law, etc., well, it's relatively it's consensual between the member states. It's consensual. When you take the UN Security Council, then the situation is more difficult. And let me just remind you two example, or one example. June 2011, Germany, non-permanent member states abstain on the resolution 1973, creating a no-fly zone and calling for an immediate ceasefire in Libya, while France and the United Kingdom, permanent members, voted for. Okay. October 2011, the vote about the application of Palestine to permanent membership of UNESCO, it's an interesting Czech position, gave rise to a complete lack of coherence between the member states. France voted yes, Italy and United Kingdom abstained. Germany voted against for UNESCO, I think. UNESCO, no. Finally, okay. But you voted against. Okay. Well, here it's clear that it's not the EEAS. Just to also to understand what the EEAS is. Which is going to change this kind of divergences. Because divergences, they result from policy and historical positions. Okay? So we have to be also clear about what the EEAS is able to do and not to do. So this is why I will consider it as a bureaucracy more than as a political body. Well, another interesting question concerning international organization is how the position of the EU should appear in the final statements of the international organization. In 2011, the UK diplomats broke more than 80 EU declarations at the UN and OSCE on the ground that the EU position was mentioned only on behalf of the European Union. I know another big member state, I'm not going to mention it, but maybe you are going to understand which one, which was not unhappy that the British colleagues played this conflictual game. Because, it was not really prepared to give too much delegation to the EU in multilateral international organization. And in the wake of this conflict, we got a sort of compromise. This is the decision, where it was a paper prepared by the Secretary General of the Council and then decided in October 2011, which says that we have to define more precisely in which case, well, position should be expressed on behalf of the EU or on behalf of the EU and the member states, okay? And what is interesting is that it's first of all the heads of delegation which have to do the work and to try to define which kind of position will be expressed in the final statement, and they are supposed to refer to the central structure in Brussels in consultation with the Commission. So it's an incentive. Conflict is an incentive for vertical coordination. The EEAS has the obligation to check, that the member states agree on the legal representation in international organization. Okay, so new procedural rules have probably produced here effects on the vertical coordination, but again, my impression is that when you are reaching the level of, well, historical questions like should we intervene, military or not, etc., well, here the limits are clear. But something we forget is that, and this is sometimes a failure from analysts working on foreign policy. Well, foreign policy is not always about this kind of heroic decision. Foreign policy is also a lot of routine. Diplomats know about that. And when we are taking routine, and routine stuff is important, well, here I think vertical coordination through these new procedures, well, probably is easier than it was in the past. So I'm just now concluding, and I'll be happy to listen to Mr. Belling comment. Well, if you look at the processes of vertical coordination, well, it's not a black and white conclusion. That's the point. I think empirical evidence shows that, well, new procedures make sometimes the vertical coordination of the EU foreign policy easier, but there are limits to this vertical coordination, both in terms of policy substance, my example on consular affairs, and limits to consensus building. I think also that we have to investigate a bit more not only the procedure but the question of identities, especially between the groups of people working inside the EEAS, the EU diplomats and national diplomats, and we have to do that with a constructivist approach, trying to see their perception, their representation, more than what they are able to do or not to do. At the end, for those who are interested in European integration more generally, I think it's a fantastic example, this institutionalization of new procedure, to see see how the EU is working, because at the same time you have convergence and resistance. Okay? And resistance probably comes more from the big member states, well, because they try to defend their national diplomacies. Small member states have less general national interests and idiosyncrasies at stake, even if small member states sometimes have some very specific interest also to defend, regional interests. Think well, Eastern Partnership, for instance, for countries from Central Europe. I'm not going to include Poland in the small member states because the Poles will be very would not consider themselves as a small member state. This is an interesting case, Poland, because Poles consider themselves as a big member state. So again, we can discuss hours and hours to know if Poland is a big or small, blah blah blah, and objective. We would never find objective criteria, but the perception, the representation is more. We are big. At the end, I think it's an excellent opportunity, this topic, not to forget that member states have to be taken seriously into account in the study of EU politics. And this is what I'm saying for 20 years to my students. If you want to understand the EU, you have to know also about comparative politics of the member states. Because if you don't know what is going on in the States, then you have only, well, part of the story about the EU. And I know it's more and more difficult now because we are 28. So when I started my work in the 80s, there were 12. So we always knew a bit about what was going on in Italian domestic politics, or in, well, Belgian domestic. But now we have to know about Estonia, Malta, etc. Much more difficult. Much more difficult. I understand. And there's a language problem. But still, try to take member states seriously. And this is a problem that I have sometimes with EU studies. You know, concentrating at the EU level and not investigating enough also in the domestic politics of the member state. And the other thing is about Europeanization. Well, you know that there are hundreds, thousands of pages written on Europeanization. It's a prolific part of the EU studies since the 90s. But here again, sometimes I have a problem with this literature because probably it's too much emphasizing the process of convergence and not considered seriously enough the problem, the resistance of the member states. And member states still produce resistance sometimes. So EEAS is an interesting institution because it's really at the crossroad of this convergent resistance dialectics. And this is why I think further studies have to be done on this body. Well, thank you very much, and I apologize for having been a bit too long.
Just on time. Thank you very much, Christian. Christian, as you already draw conclusions, let me just try to sum up your presentation in few words. Based on empirical evidence and observation of a 3-year time experience of the EEAS, you explored 3 dimensions of vertical coordination of foreign EU policy. The first one was about the staff, and you underlined the importance of perceptions of different member states and the EU administration, a lack of trust between participants. Second point, second dimension about the means, the share of resources, and you explore differences of interest, of approach between big and smaller member states, and you took example of co-locations of diplomatic services with EU delegations and national embassies. And of course, you spoke about convergence, coming more from smaller countries, and resistance coming more from bigger member states. And finally, the third dimension you observed were about new procedures implemented to ensure the vertical coordination. And you said that institutions are not substitutes to power in third countries. So, Mr. Belling, Mr. State Secretary, would be happy to hear you on that for comments based on your own experience. Thank you very much. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Professor, for your really excellent contribution. And I can really have only a few comments on that. And at first, I have to say that I have no direct personal experience with the EEAS, because I am responsible for the overall coordination of the European politics. But you know that particularly the foreign policy is a sovereign task of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and definitely any colleague from Ministry of Foreign Affairs could make more comments from his or her practical experience. So I will speak more perhaps also from some academic perspective from abroad, combining that with some experiences from my position. But at first I have to say that as I also understood your contribution, I would from this perspective distinguish between some limits which are systemic to the EEAS and its current structure based on the legislative framework and the overall consensus from the Lisbon Treaty, and some factors or some limits which are based on the resistance of member states, voluntary resistance of member states, or to say it in other words, on the lack of willingness to do something more in that area. And we should distinguish these two forms of limits, because the systemic limits are really very difficult to be eliminated until we don't change the whole structure. You have mentioned the problem of esprit de corps, which is also in my perspective very important as a problem. There is an interesting research on this in the last in the Journal of Common Market Studies from last year, an interesting article from Karolina Pomorska, analyzing many factors on which are really complicating the esprit de corps. She's saying that one of the main problems is the lack of leadership there, and a lack of chain of command in the EEAS, so a lack of top-down approach, so to say. I can only agree with this analysis, but I have to say that it is very deeply connected with the problem of technocratization of foreign policy, or bureaucratization of foreign policy and negotiation. In the time as we had a rotating presidency, you said very clearly that it was perhaps some time too oriented, too directed to specific interest of the presidency state. So in Polish case, Eastern Partnership, or other issues. In Czech case, the same, of course. In Swedish case, human rights, and so on and so on. I agree. But on the other hand, these are some political incentives which are there, which can compensate somehow the technocratic structure of the decision making in the whole system. If we are replacing, or if we have replaced the rotating presidency with permanent management, of course, from the point of view of effectiveness, it's perfect. It's functioning much more better, probably. But on the other hand, there is a lack of really political decision making. If you have a Ministry of Foreign Affairs, of course, there is also an overall tendency that's not specific for the European Union, but for all states, to a technocratization of politics in general, and not only in foreign policy. but on the other hand, there is still a foreign minister who can influence somehow even his own staff, even if with some limits even there, I have to say. The same for the rest of the public administration, of course. But anyway, if there is a minister with strong interest for human rights, probably he will really make impacts here. And if there is a minister with interest in economic diplomacy, perhaps the direction will be slightly different, even if the role of the staff of the administration will be very strong there. So this is, but the problem here is that there is a lack of really political leadership in the EEAS, and I'm not meaning that as a criticism as a personal criticism. This is a systemic problem. The personal part is different. I know that it is even in the media. It's a very popular topic, but I'm not speaking about that. For me, it's really a systemic problem, leading to the fact that, of course, the one who is really the decision maker will remain the member states in most important question, or there is this technocratization and more a bottom-up approach, which is very complicated in a functioning diplomatic system. So this is for me a huge problem, and I have to also say that the foreign policy is in this respect very different topic in comparison with other areas or areas of internal politics, even at the EU level. So I said that there is a general tendency to the technocratization or bureaucratization of politics, but at the same time, if speaking about community interests, and you said you make this quotation of a certain official from the EU saying that the national diplomats are not representing the community interest. The problem is that the definition of the community interest is in the case of foreign policy extremely complicated. You can define some community interest at the expert level in some policy areas, perhaps. I can imagine that in areas even of economics and so on, but in the foreign policy, it's only about politics and political decision. There is no possibility of really expert assessment what to do in the foreign policy towards Libya, towards Syria, and so on. It will be always a political decision making. So this is really for me the main structure problem. Then, as I have said, there is also the problem of the resistance of member states and their unwillingness. This is perhaps more the problem of big member states, even if in the recent study from European Policy Center, where also Mr. Beneš contributed, I read even in the first part of this, in the conclusions, that the Czech Republic is the country with most restrictive attitude towards EEAS from the all member states, including UK. Very, very interesting, and perhaps even correct. This is dealing. I have to say, as a civil servant from the office of the government, that this study was based, as I understood, on interviews with the diplomats, not with other parts of the public service. But anyway, even here you see this attitude. But anyway, in principle, this is more the attitude of big member states. You mentioned also the question of consular affairs and the British approach to this. I think that this can lead in future even to the tendency of smaller member states to coordinate themselves in some area, perhaps on a deeper basis, particularly in the consular affairs and some unification of consular affairs in the delegations abroad. Concerning the main question of who decides, I think that this leads then, or this makes also the limits of the possibility of coordination in EU delegations in third countries. For me, it's not so much the problem of, I would say, the problem of the third states who are not perceiving the role of EU delegations or are not paying too attention to EU delegations, but the third states are simply behaving according to the fact who is really the decision maker. So in the case of Beirut, of course, if they see that the decision maker who really influence the decision making in the central, in Brussels, in Paris, in UK and so on, will be the French and British ambassador. So of course there is a natural tendency of the foreign policy of Lebanon to go at first to the ambassadors of France and UK and not to the EU delegation. Of course, if that would be different, if that would be really the Union who is making the content of the foreign policy and the EEAS, then it would be different. But as long as this is not the case, it will be always the foreign diplomat, the diplomat of a member states having the main role here. And perhaps third and last remark, I see that there is also a quite important systemic limit in the possibility of economic diplomacy. This is a very specific issue, and whereas in the normal traditional foreign policy, I think there is, and you said it clearly, in the cases of routine, a strong possibility of coordination, and only in cases of exception or very sensitive cases there will be still, of course, the central role of member states. In the economic diplomacy, that's different, because the interests of member states are so divergent, and of course naturally divergent as long as the economic policies of member states are divergent, that here I see also quite a limiting factor for the effectiveness of the EEAS. So that's all from my side. Thank you once again for the excellent contribution, which was really very even for me and with this experience. It was very nice for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
On a day-to-day basis, Mr. Belling, you have to do with another coordination, so between the office of the government and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So you are still relevant for for the paper. Christian, maybe you would like to react to what Mr. Belling said.
Thank you very much to State Secretary Belling for his comments, and found them very relevant. What you said about consular affairs and coordination of small member states, well, probably goes maybe beyond. It's a Schengen member state, I think, which will have probably to do something. And this is a point I didn't mention, but UK is not participating in Schengen, so it's also a very specific case with Ireland inside the EU. And if you take well, the Schengen procedure, the visa, etc., then I fear, well, here a big opportunity to rationalize the system and to save money for national budgets. Of course, that needs well, the delegation need to have the technical knowledge for that, and this is another story. But and national diplomats, I don't know what's the situation in Czech Republic, but when you try to second them in well, an international organization or in the EU, well, this is not to do consular affairs. People are not particularly interested to do consular affairs, you know. So even inside the ministries of foreign affairs, people are not really tempted to take a consular post, you know. Well, which is something maybe a bit striking, because consular affairs, I mean, it's becomes highly political, because it's also the question of how do you deal with the diasporas abroad, etc., etc. So, but it's like this. I mean, in the tradition of the ministries of foreign affairs, consular affairs is not the noble part of the work, to say the things well. So seconded national diplomats will not be easy. So what does it mean? It means creating a special corps of consular officers, even consular officers. Why not? Why not? But that costs money.